Schoolteacher read to Cowboy at night, never guessing he'd write their wedding vows. She saw the tears first. Sarah Mitchell had been reading aloud for 20 minutes, her voice soft and steady in the empty schoolhouse, the only sound besides the wind scraping against the wooden walls, when she glanced up and saw him through the window. A cowboy, his hat pulled low, his shoulders pressed against the outer frame, and his face, dirt-streaked, sun-scarred, older than it should have been, was wet. He didn't know she'd seen him. He stood there in the October cold, lips moving, silently shaping the words she was speaking. His eyes were closed. His hands gripped the windowsill like a man holding onto the edge of something he was afraid to fall from. Sarah's breath caught. Her voice faltered mid-sentence, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the lantern on her desk. Then she kept reading, slower now, quieter, as if the story itself had become a kind of bridge between them. It wasn't the first time he'd come. For 3 months, every Tuesday night, the same cowboy had appeared outside her window just after sundown. Sarah had noticed him in early July, a shadow against the dim light of the schoolhouse. At first, she thought he was a drifter looking for shelter, or maybe a ranch hand with nowhere else to go. Belford was a small town in the dust-choked heart of Kansas, and men like him passed through often, nameless, silent, carrying everything they owned in a bedroll and a worn-out saddle. But he never knocked, never asked for anything. He just stood there, outside the window, listening. Sarah had been a schoolteacher in Belford for 2 years, and she'd grown used to loneliness. Her students were children of ranchers and homesteaders, families who worked from dawn until dark and had little patience for books or learning. Most of them could barely write their own names. Their fathers didn't see the point. Their mothers were too tired to care. So Sarah read aloud at night, to the empty room, to herself, to no one. She read because it made her feel less alone. Because the sound of her own voice reminded her that she still existed, that she hadn't disappeared into the silence of the plains like so many women before her. She never imagined anyone was listening, but he was. And now, standing at her desk with a book open in her trembling hands, Sarah understood something that made her chest ache. This cowboy, this stranger who had never spoken a single word to her, had been coming here not for shelter, but for her voice, for the stories, for something he couldn't name, but needed the way a man in the desert needs water. When she finished the chapter, she set the book down carefully. Her hands were shaking. She looked toward the window, but he was already gone, just the empty night and the wind. She didn't sleep that night. The next Tuesday, he came again. This time, Sarah was ready. She'd chosen a different story, something softer, slower, about a man who traveled across the ocean to find his way home. She read it aloud the way she always did, but now she read it for him. She didn't look at the window. She didn't want to scare him away. But halfway through, she heard it, a sound so quiet she almost missed it, a sob. Broken and raw, like something torn from a man's throat against his will. Sarah stopped reading. She set the book down, walked slowly to the door, and opened it. The cowboy was still there, leaning against the side of the schoolhouse, his face buried in his hands. His hat had fallen into the dirt. His shoulders shook. "Sir," she said softly. He looked up, startled, his eyes red, his face streaked with tears and dust. For a moment, he just stared at her, like a man caught doing something shameful. Then he stood, grabbed his hat, and turned to leave. "Wait," Sarah said. He stopped, didn't turn around, just stood there in the moonlight, his back to her, his hands clenched at his sides. "You don't have to go," she said. Her voice was gentle, careful. "You can come inside, if you want." He didn't move. "I won't ask you anything," she continued. "You don't have to speak. But it's cold out here. And if you're going to listen, you might as well be warm." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then slowly, the cowboy turned. His face was unreadable, grief and shame and something else she couldn't name. He nodded once, just barely, and followed her inside. He sat in the back of the schoolhouse, in the smallest chair, his long legs folded awkwardly beneath the child-sized desk. Sarah returned to her place at the front of the room and picked up the book again. She didn't say anything. She just kept reading. and he listened. That became their rhythm. Every Tuesday night, the cowboy came to the schoolhouse. He never spoke, never asked questions. He just sat in the back, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on her face as she read. Sometimes his lips moved, shaping the words she spoke. Sometimes he closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him like rain. Sarah began to choose stories she thought he might like, tales of men who'd lost everything and found something worth living for, of women who waited by windows, of journeys that led nowhere and everywhere at once. She read about loneliness and hope, about mistakes and second chances. She read the way a preacher might pray, with intention, with care, with the quiet belief that words could save a life. And slowly, without either of them saying it aloud, something shifted. One night in September, after she finished reading, the cowboy stood. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased and worn, like he'd been carrying it for a long time. He held it out to her, his hand trembling. Sarah took it carefully. She unfolded it in the lantern light. It was covered in marks, lines and scratches that weren't quite letters, shapes that almost looked like words but weren't. At the top, written in a shaky, childlike hand, was a single word she could barely make out. Sarah. Her throat tightened. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw him clearly, not as a drifter, not as a nameless cowboy, but as a man. A man who had been trying, for weeks, to write her name. A man who had been listening to her voice and memorizing every word because he couldn't read them himself. "You've been practicing," she whispered. He nodded. His jaw tightened, and he looked away, as if ashamed. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, and she meant it. The cowboy's eyes filled with tears again, but this time, he didn't hide them. He just stood there, looking at her like she'd given him something he'd never thought he could have. And in that moment, Sarah realized something that would change everything. She wasn't just teaching him to read. She was teaching him that he mattered. "I've been writing you letters." The words came out broken, barely a whisper, and Sarah looked up from the primer she'd been holding. Jack sat across from her at the small wooden desk, his hands flat on the surface, his head bowed. His shoulders were tight, his jaw clenched. He looked like a man confessing a crime. "Letters?" Sarah asked softly. He nodded, but didn't look at her. His fingers curled into fists. "In my head. For months now. Every night, before I sleep. Every morning, when I wake. I write them to you, but I can't." His voice cracked. "I can't make my hands do what my mind knows." Sarah's heart twisted. She set the primer down slowly, her hands suddenly unsteady. Outside, the October wind had gone quiet, leaving only the faint hiss of the kerosene lamp between them. The schoolhouse smelled of chalk dust and old wood, and in the flickering light, Jack looked like a man coming apart at the seams. "What do they say?" she whispered. "The letters." He shook his head. "Things I got no right to say. Things a man like me shouldn't even think." "Jack, I'm nobody," he said, his voice rough. "A drifter. A ranch hand. I can't even write my own name without it looking like a child did it. And you," he finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it made her breath catch. "You're a schoolteacher. You read books I'll never understand. You speak like the words come easy, like they were born inside you. And I'm nothing." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over his. His skin was rough, calloused from years of hard labor, roping cattle, mending fences, working under the brutal Kansas sun. But beneath the roughness, she felt him trembling. "You're not nothing," she said firmly. "Don't ever say that." He pulled his hand away, but gently, as if he didn't want to hurt her. "You don't know what it's like," he said, "to have words locked inside you, to feel them right here." He pressed a fist against his chest, "but not be able to get them out. I see signs on buildings, and I don't know what they say. I see wanted posters, and I can't tell if it's me they're looking for. I hear men talk about what they read in newspapers, and I just stay quiet. They call me Silent Jack, but it ain't because I don't have nothing to say. It's because I don't know how." Sarah's throat tightened. She'd known, of course, known from the first night he'd sat in her schoolhouse that he couldn't read. But she hadn't understood the weight of it. The shame. The loneliness of living in a world made of words you couldn't touch. "That's why you came," she said quietly. "Why you listened at the window." He nodded. "Your voice, it made the words make sense. When you read, I could see them. I could feel them. It was like I wasn't stupid anymore. Like maybe if I listened long enough, I could learn to be the kind of man who deserved to hear stories like that." "Jack, I know it's foolish," he said quickly. "I know I got no business being here. You're a proper woman, a teacher, and I'm just some cowboy who drifts from ranch to ranch because no one wants to keep me long enough to know my name. But when I'm here, when you read to me, I feel like maybe I matter. Like maybe I'm not just another pair of hands." Sarah stood, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. She moved around the desk and knelt beside him, so they were eye to level. Jack stiffened, but didn't pull away. "You do matter," she said, her voice steady and sure. "You matter to me." He looked at her, then really looked at her, and something in his expression broke open. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would someone like you care about someone like me?" "Because you came back," Sarah said simply. "Every Tuesday night, you came back. Not because you had to. Not because anyone told you to. But because you wanted to learn. Because you wanted to be more than what the world told you were. That takes courage, Jack. More courage than most men will ever have." His eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them back hard, his jaw tight. "I still can't write you a real letter," he said hoarsely. "I still can't tell you the things I want to say." "Then let me teach you," Sarah said. "Let me help you find the words." He shook his head slowly. "It'll take too long. I'm too old. Too far behind." "No," she said firmly. "You're not. You're right here. And that's enough." For a long moment, Jack just stared at her. Then, slowly, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the same folded paper he'd shown her weeks before, the one with her name scratched at the top in his shaky, uncertain hand. But this time, when he unfolded it, she saw more. Dozens of marks, lines, shapes that almost looked like words. Attempts. Failures. Tries and tries and tries again. "I've been practicing," he said quietly. "Every night. I take a stick and I draw in the dirt outside the bunkhouse. I try to remember the shapes you showed me. The letters. I don't know if I'm doing it right, but I keep trying." Sarah took the paper from him, her hands trembling. She looked at the marks, crooked, uneven, heartbreaking in their honesty, and she saw something that made her chest ache. Not failure, not stupidity, but hope. The kind of hope that keeps a man going even when the world tells him to quit. "You're doing it right," she whispered. "You're doing it exactly right." Jack exhaled a long, shaking breath, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled. It was small, fragile, like something that might break if she looked at it too hard. But it was real. "Will you keep teaching me?" he asked. "Yes," Sarah said. "Every night, if you want." "I want," he said. "I want to learn to write those letters. The real ones. So you can read them." "What will they say?" she asked softly. Jack looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw everything he couldn't yet put into words. Everything he was afraid to name. Everything that had been growing between them in the quiet of the schoolhouse, in the space between her voice and his listening. "They'll say the truth," he whispered. "That's all I got." And Sarah, kneeling there on the dusty schoolhouse floor beside a cowboy who'd been told his whole life he didn't matter, felt something shift inside her. Something that had been closed for so long it hurt to open. But she let it open anyway. Because Jack was right. The truth was all any of them had. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Over the next weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Sarah taught him letters, one at a time. The curve of an S, the sharp line of a T, the loop of a G. She taught him how to hold a pencil, how to press it against paper without breaking the lead, how to shape words slowly and with care. And Jack learned. Not quickly, not easily, but with a determination that made Sarah's heart ache every time she watched him. He made mistakes. He got frustrated. Some nights, he crumpled the paper and threw it across the room, his hands shaking, his face red with shame. But Sarah never let him quit. She picked up the paper, smoothed it out, and handed it back to him. Again, she'd say gently, "Try again." And he did. The townspeople noticed, of course. In a place like Belford, nothing stayed secret for long. They whispered about the schoolteacher who spent her evenings alone with a drifter. They said it wasn't proper, that she was risking her reputation, that a woman like her shouldn't waste her time on a man like him. But Sarah didn't care, because she saw what they didn't. She saw the way Jack's face lit up when he finally wrote a whole word on his own. She saw the way he carried his primer with him everywhere, tucked inside his vest like a treasure. She saw the way he looked at her, not with lust or expectation, but with something deeper, something that felt like reverence. And slowly, without meaning to, she began to fall in love with him. Not because he was handsome, though he was, in a weathered, hard-worn way. Not because he was charming, because he wasn't. He barely spoke outside their lessons. But because he was honest. Because he was trying. Because he saw her not as a teacher or a proper woman or someone to be impressed, but as someone who'd given him something no one else ever had. The belief that he could be more. And that, Sarah realized, was the rarest kind of love. The kind that asked for nothing and gave everything. Sarah saw her name in his handwriting and broke. She'd been standing at the chalkboard, explaining the difference between a capital and lowercase letter, when Jack held up his paper. His hand trembled slightly, the way it always did when he was nervous. But his eyes, those quiet, storm-gray eyes, held something new. Pride, hope, fear all mixed together. "I did it," he said softly. "On my own. No copying. No looking." Sarah crossed the empty schoolhouse slowly, her skirts whispering against the wooden floor. She took the paper from him, and there it was, written in pencil across the top of the page. Sarah. The letters were crooked. The S leaned too far to the left. The O was too small and the H too tall. But it was her name. Written by him. Alone. Without her guiding his hand or showing him the shapes. She pressed the paper to her chest and wept. Not quietly, not gracefully, but with the kind of tears that come from someplace deep and ancient, the place where all the loneliness lives, where all the years of being invisible finally break open. She stood there in the dim November light, crying like her heart was being pulled out of her body, and Jack just watched her with an expression of pure terror. Did I do it wrong?" he asked, starting to rise from his chair. "No," Sarah choked out, shaking her head. "No, you did it perfectly." "Then why?" "Because it matters," she said, looking at him through her tears. "Because you matter. Because you wanted to write my name, and you did. And that's everything, Jack. That's everything." He stood slowly, uncertain, and then he did something he'd never done before. He reached out and touched her face, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear. His hand was rough from years of ranch work, mending fences, breaking horses, hauling water under the unforgiving prairie sun. But his touch was gentle, careful. Like she was something precious he was afraid to break. "I've been wanting to say things to you," he whispered. "Real things. Not just in my head no more. I've been wanting to tell you that when I wake up in the bunkhouse, the first thing I think about is coming here. That your voice is the only thing that makes this world feel like it got any beauty left in it. That I ain't never felt like I mattered to nobody until I met you." Sarah's breath caught. The lamplight flickered between them, casting shadows that danced across the schoolhouse walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows, but inside it was quiet. So quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. "Jack," she whispered. "I know I got no right," he continued, his voice breaking. "I know I'm just a drifter, just a cowboy with nothing to his name but a horse and a saddle. I know you're a teacher, a proper woman, and I'm—" She kissed him. It wasn't planned, wasn't thought through. She just rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his, cutting off his words, stopping the flood of self-doubt that poured out of him like water from a cracked dam. And for a moment, Jack froze, completely still, like he couldn't believe what was happening. Then he kissed her back, slowly, carefully, like a man who'd never been given anything good and didn't know how to hold it without crushing it. His hands moved to her waist, gentle and trembling, and Sarah felt something inside her break open, something she'd kept locked away for so long she'd forgotten it was there. When they finally pulled apart, Jack was crying, silent tears that cut tracks through the dust on his face. "I love you," he said, the words rough and raw. "I don't know how to say it pretty, but I love you. I think I've been loving you since the first night I heard you read." Sarah smiled through her own tears. "I love you too." And in that moment, in a one-room schoolhouse that smelled of chalk and kerosene, two broken people became whole. But love in a town like Belford didn't stay secret for long. The church women came on a Thursday morning, 3 days after Jack had written Sarah's name. They arrived in a tight formation, Mrs. Garrett, Mrs. Hobbs, and Mrs. Fletcher, their faces pinched with disapproval, their Sunday dresses buttoned up to their chins despite the autumn warmth. Sarah was teaching when they walked in. Her students, 12 children ranging from 6 to 14, looked up in confusion as the women marched to the front of the classroom. Sarah set down her chalk and turned to face them, her heart already sinking. "Ladies," she said evenly, "can I help you?" Mrs. Garrett stepped forward. She was the oldest of the three, a widow who'd buried 2 husbands and wore her grief like armor. "We need to speak with you, Miss Mitchell. In private." Sarah glanced at her students. "I'm teaching." "It can't wait," Mrs. Fletcher said sharply. She was younger, harder, with eyes that missed nothing. "This is about your reputation, and the reputation of this school." Sarah's stomach tightened. She dismissed her students early, watching as they filed out in confused silence. When the last child had gone, she turned back to the women and folded her arms across her chest. "What is this about?" "You know exactly what this is about," Mrs. Hobbs said. She was the kindest of the three, but even her voice carried judgment. "The drifter. The one they call Silent Jack. People have seen him coming here at night, seen him leaving after dark, and you, alone with him, unchaperoned." "I'm teaching him to read," Sarah said calmly, though her heart was racing. "That's all." "That's not all people are saying," Mrs. Garrett snapped. "They're saying you're meeting him in secret, that you're behaving in ways unbecoming of a schoolteacher." "I'm doing nothing wrong." "You're spending time alone with a man," Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice cold. "A ranch hand. A nobody. And you're a teacher, Miss Mitchell. You're supposed to set an example for the children of this town. Instead, I'm helping someone learn to read," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite the anger rising in her chest. "Something he was never given a chance to do. Something that every person in this town takes for granted. Is that such a terrible crime?" "It's improper," Mrs. Garrett said firmly. "And if you continue, we'll have no choice but to bring this before the school board. They'll dismiss you." The words hit Sarah like a slap. She'd known this was coming, known from the moment Jack first kissed her that the town would turn against them. But hearing it said aloud made it real, made it dangerous. "So you want me to stop teaching him?" Sarah said quietly. "We want you to remember your place," Mrs. Hobbs said, her voice almost gentle. "You're a good teacher, Sarah. Don't throw it all away for a man who'll be gone by spring." "He's not leaving," Sarah said. The 3 women exchanged glances. Mrs. Fletcher's mouth twisted into something cruel. "They all leave, dear. Men like that don't stay. They take what they want and they move on. And you'll be left here alone, with nothing but a ruined name." "You don't know him," Sarah said, her voice shaking now. "You don't know anything about him." "We know enough," Mrs. Garrett said. "We know he's not worthy of you. And we know that if you keep this up, you'll lose everything you've worked for." They left after that, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor, their shadows long and cold in the morning light. Sarah stood alone in the empty schoolhouse, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She thought about what they'd said, about her reputation, her position, the life she'd built in Belford, small and quiet and safe. And then she thought about Jack, about the way he'd written her name, about the way he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world worth seeing. about the way he'd said "I love you" like it was the truest thing he'd ever spoken. She thought about all of it. And then she made her choice. That night, when Jack came to the schoolhouse, Sarah was waiting for him. She'd lit the lamp, set out paper and pencils, opened the primer to a new lesson. He stopped in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his face uncertain. "They came to see you, didn't they?" "The church women." "Yes," Sarah said. "What did they say?" She looked at him across the small room. This man who'd learned to write her name, who'd memorize her voice, who'd given her something she'd never thought she'd have, a love that saw her, truly saw her, not as a teacher or a proper woman, but as herself. "They said I have to choose," Sarah said quietly. "My reputation or you." Jack's face crumpled. He started to turn away. "Then I'll go." "I won't let you lose." "I choose you," Sarah said. He stopped, turned back, stared at her like he didn't understand the words. "I choose you," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "I don't care what they say. I don't care what they think. You're the only thing in this town that makes me feel alive. And I'm not giving that up. Not for them. Not for anyone." Jack crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. And Sarah held him back, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her chest, knowing that whatever came next, whatever judgment, whatever loss, they would face it together. Because some things were worth fighting for. And love, real love, was one of them. Jack's hands were shaking so hard he almost couldn't unfold the paper. They stood beneath the cottonwood tree on the edge of town, where the prairie stretched out forever and the sky felt close enough to touch. It was late October, and the leaves above them had turned gold, falling in slow spirals every time the wind picked up. Sarah wore a simple dress, cream-colored cotton, nothing fancy, and held a handful of wildflowers her former student, little Emma Crane, had picked that morning. Jack wore his cleanest shirt, his vest brushed free of dust, his hat in his hands. The preacher stood between them, Reverend Thomas, an old man with kind eyes who'd agreed to marry them despite the town's disapproval. Behind them stood 2 witnesses, Mr. Crane, the blacksmith who'd always treated Jack with respect, and his wife, Martha, who'd cried when Sarah had asked her to stand with them. No one else came. No church ladies. No school board members. No crowd of well-wishers throwing rice or singing hymns. Just the 5 of them, the cottonwood tree and the wind. The preacher opened his Bible. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice steady and warm, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Sarah felt tears already building in her throat. She looked at Jack, at this cowboy who'd stood outside her window and listened, who'd learned to write her name, who'd chosen her even when the world told him he shouldn't, and she knew she'd never loved anyone the way she loved him. The preacher continued through the opening words, speaking about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. Then he turned to Jack. "Do you, Jack?" The preacher paused. "I'm sorry, son. I don't believe I ever got your full name." Jack's jaw tightened. "Just Jack," he said quietly. "That's all I got." The preacher nodded gently, understanding something he didn't need explained. "Do you, Jack, take Sarah to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" This was the moment. The moment Jack was supposed to say, "I do," and let the preacher move on to Sarah's vows. Simple. Traditional. The way it had been done 1,000 times before. But Jack didn't say "I do." Instead, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he opened it, the paper crackling in the autumn silence. Sarah's breath caught. The preacher looked confused. Mr. and Mrs. Crane exchanged glances. "I wrote something," Jack said, his voice rough. If that's all right." The preacher smiled. "Of course, son. Go ahead." Jack looked down at the paper. His hands shook so badly the words seemed to dance across the page. He took a deep breath, and Sarah saw him mouth a silent prayer, or maybe just gathering courage. Then he began to read. "Sarah." His voice cracked on her name, and he had to stop, clear his throat, start again. "Sarah, I ain't good with words. Not the fancy kind that come easy to people like you. But I've been practicing. I've been writing this for 2 weeks now, every night after work, trying to get it right. And I know it ain't perfect. I know the letters are crooked and probably some of the spelling's wrong. But it's mine. And it's true. He paused, his eyes moving across the page, and Sarah felt tears spill down her cheeks. I don't got much to give you, Jack continued, reading slowly, carefully, each word deliberate. I don't got land or money or a fancy house. I don't got family or a name that means something. All I got is a horse, a saddle, and these 2 hands. But I promise you this. I will work every day of my life to make you happy. I will bring you fresh water every morning before the sun comes up. I will keep a fire going so you never wake up cold. I will fix anything that breaks and build anything you need. I will listen when you read and learn everything you teach me. I will be faithful to you until the day I die, and I will never make you feel small or worthless or alone. His voice broke, and he had to stop again. Sarah couldn't stop crying. Even Mrs. Crane was wiping her eyes. The preacher stood silent, letting Jack take his time. I know the town don't think I'm good enough for you, Jack read, his voice steadier now. And maybe they're right. Maybe I ain't. But I will spend every day trying to be. I will be the kind of man who deserves a woman like you. Not because of what I can do or what I got, but because of how hard I'll try. Because you make me want to be better. You make me feel like I matter. And I never felt that before. He looked up from the paper then, his storm gray eyes meeting Sarah's, and the love in them was so raw, so honest, it made her chest ache. I can't promise you an easy life, he said, no longer reading, just speaking from his heart. I can't promise we'll have everything we want. But I can promise you this. You will never doubt that you are loved. You will never wonder if you matter. Because you do, Sarah. You matter more than anything in this world. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know it. The silence that followed was so complete. Sarah could hear the cottonwood leaves falling around them, whispering as they touched the ground. The preacher wiped his own eyes. Mr. Crane cleared his throat roughly and looked away. Mrs. Crane sobbed openly. And Sarah looked at the man standing before her. This drifter the town had dismissed, this cowboy they'd called worthless. And she saw what they refused to see, a man who'd learned to write not just letters, but love itself. Yes, she whispered, though no one had asked her a question yet. Yes, Jack. I take you. I choose you. I will always choose you. Jack folded the paper carefully and put it back in his vest pocket, right over his heart. Then he reached out and took Sarah's hands in his, those rough, calloused hands that had learned to hold a pencil, to shape words, to write promises he intended to keep. The preacher finished the ceremony, his voice thick with emotion. He pronounced them husband and wife. He told Jack he could kiss his bride. And when Jack leaned forward and pressed his lips to Sarah's, gentle and reverent, it felt like the whole world stopped turning. Like for that one moment, nothing else mattered. Not the town's judgment, not their uncertain future, not the hard winters or lean years that might come. All that mattered was this. 2 people who'd found each other in the loneliness of the frontier and decided to build something together. Something real. Something that couldn't be taken away by gossip or poverty or all the ways the world tried to break people like them. After the ceremony, Mr. and Mrs. Crane hugged them both and invited them to Sunday dinner. The preacher shook Jack's hand and told him those were the finest vows he'd heard in 40 years of marrying people. Then the witnesses left, walking back toward town, and Jack and Sarah stood alone beneath the cottonwood tree. Can I see it? Sarah asked softly. The vows you wrote? Jack pulled the paper from his pocket and handed it to her. Sarah unfolded it carefully, and there, in his unsteady but determined handwriting, were the words he'd read. Words he'd practiced. Words he'd learned to write because he wanted to give her something no one else could. Himself, honest and whole. At the bottom of the page, below the vows, he'd written one more line. Sarah read it aloud, her voice breaking. Thank you for teaching me that I matter. She looked up at him, this man who was now her husband, and she understood something profound. Love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about fancy words or grand gestures or having everything figured out. Love was about showing up, about trying, about learning to speak when the world had told you to stay silent. Love was about writing your own vows, even when your hands shook and the letters were crooked, because some promises were too important not to say. Sarah folded the paper and gave it back to Jack. He tucked it carefully into his vest pocket, right over his heart, where he'd carry it for the rest of his life. Then they walked together toward their future, uncertain, imperfect, and more beautiful than either of them had ever dared to hope for. Two people who'd learned that the most important words weren't the ones you were given, but the ones you found the courage to write yourself. And in the distance, the prairie stretched on forever, golden and endless, like all the days that lay ahead of them.